Okay, good evening, everyone, or good afternoon, depending where you are in the world. It's 8:30 here in Israel. I think it's 2:30 on the East Coast of the United States because your clocks have gone forward. Welcome to the latest in these Wednesday evening English events at the Begin Center, or on the Begin Center Zoom, I should say. My name is Paul Gross. I'm a senior fellow here at the Begin Center. I know many of you have participated in many of these that we've been doing for the past several months now. We've had a lot of different guests talking about current affairs, history, books they've written, other topics related to the Middle East, to Menachem Begin, to Zionism and the Jewish world. And all of them have been, I think, enlightening and informative and interesting events. And I thank you all for participating and for returning week after week for these events. Okay, we're going to be today discussing something very current, very important. Next week's elections. It's that time of year again. Election time in Israel. Maybe it's twice a year at the moment. I lose track, but certainly our fourth elections in 2 years. And we're going to be discussing them with really one of the most, I think, sophisticated and important writers and thinkers on Israeli politics here in Israel, the founding editor of the Times of Israel, David Horovitz. So David, welcome. Thank you very much for joining us.
Hi, Paul. How you doing?
Good, thank you. David and I are gonna talk for about half an hour, and then we'll go to questions from the audience. So please do write questions in using the chat facility at the bottom of your screen. At David's request, I'm not reading out his lengthy and impressive bio. I do want to mention, though, that about 20 years ago, David wrote a book called Still Life with Bombers, which was, to my mind, at least, the best book written about the Second Intifada and its impact on life in Israel and its longer-term impact on Israeli politics. And I mention it partly because actually the first time I met David Horovitz was when he was launching the book in London. David, I don't know if you remember launching the book in London, an event when I was still living in the UK before I made Aliyah. And it was the first time I heard David speak, and I still have that copy of the book with David's autograph in it. Thank you very much. You wrote something very nice in it. And the other reason I mention it is because in that book, you really note the beginning of the end of that long time right-left divide in Israel, that with supporters and opponents of a two-state solution reliably voting for a selection of right-wing, left-wing parties. And in this election, like the last three in this crazy period, the real divide seems to be not ideology or the conflict or anything like that, but the divide between supporters and opponents of the Prime Minister. And I wanted to ask you first off, is that how you see it? Do you think there's anything else, any sort of ideological debate going on, or is it really as simple as they say, Rak Bibi or Rak Lo Bibi?
So first of all, hey Paul, do you remember where that event was? Since there's just the two of us on this call.
I think it was like a hotel somewhere in North London, but
wow, it
was 20 years ago. I don't remember.
A long time ago. So thank you. That's a very nice little mention. I appreciate that. Yeah, I think it's very much a non-ideological election if we think of ideology in the way we normally think of ideology. There's a bit of an ideological element in that there are supporters and critics of Netanyahu who think that there are democratic issues or issues relating to our democracy involved here, and those are certainly ideological. But in terms of left-right, this election is spectacularly even more about Netanyahu than the previous three, because the big difference this time is that, if you just look, those of you who are in Israel, if you look at how the pollsters try to represent their opinion polls these days on TV, graphically, they can't do it anymore. We've had years and years of election polling split into blocks, left and right, and the natural coalition partners on either side of the left-right divide. And it already got complicated previous two elections with Lieberman, who lives in the settlement of Nokdim and is certainly hawkish in terms of his political views, was now campaigning very strongly against Netanyahu. And of course, it was Lieberman who prevented Netanyahu forming a coalition at the beginning of this four-time election process that we've had. But with these elections, you can no longer ideologically group the parties into two camps. There's ridiculous stuff going on where, Naftali Bennett is supposedly the kingmaker between what you're programmed to think is the left and the right, but it's not the left and the right at all. The Islamic party, Ram, breakaway from the joint list, nobody knows where to put it. Its leader seemed to think that he would be amenable to being wooed by Netanyahu, who has said that I'm not interested in relying on him at all. So there's very curious stuff going on there. And again, so where do you place a party like that had been in some kind of contact with Netanyahu, is loathed by the anti-Netanyahu camp and loathed by the Netanyahu camp as well. So I guess he belongs in a whole separate place, but where to put him. So, Palestinian issues, even socioeconomic issues, although they're in there somewhere, but I suppose most strikingly Palestinian issues, they're just nowhere in this election, not because the candidates do not have strong views, because they really do. It's just that the blocks of support do not break down along those lines. They break down most dramatically along the lines of, do you want Netanyahu to remain prime minister or do you not? And that's, I don't even know if that's going to, I don't know how people are going to make their minds up. We've made our mind up in Israel for years over security issues, I think more than anything else. But it's definitely different this time. And the fact that Gideon Sa'ar broke away from Likud and is telling his supporters and wooing supporters by arguing that the prime imperative of the moment, the most important thing, is to get rid of Netanyahu, he was his cabinet secretary, he was his education minister, a variety of posts. And one last thing on that, very strikingly, the three key right-wing leaders who are assuring the public that our interest as a nation requires Netanyahu going, all worked with Netanyahu before they became senior politicians in their own right. Lieberman was his bureau chief. Bennett had a senior position in his office. Gideon Sa'ar, as I said, was the cabinet secretary before they became politicians, and all were ministers in his government. And all three of them are now trying to tell the electorate that, while much of the electorate may think differently, no, they think the most important thing for Israel now is to get rid of Netanyahu.
Right, and Bennett, as you said, Bennett has is set himself up, at least in principle, as with this kingmaker role, because he's the one who hasn't said that he won't sit with Netanyahu, and in theory he could go either way. But I mean, it seems to me that if it really came down to it, is it really plausible that he would join this sort of right, center, left, anti-Netanyahu bloc, which would include Labour, I assume, for example, and Yesh Atid, which also in principle supports two states. Would Bennett, right-wing party, support settlements, annexation, would they join that rather than join the Netanyahu bloc? Is that plausible?
Okay, so we should be really careful in this conversation to try not to predict things, because I mean, again, people from abroad, especially if you're in like a country like America or Britain, and believe me, of course, every country has its own election mechanic issues and its political realities. But when you're trying to work out what's going to happen here, and you're looking at opinion polls every night, I'm not a statistician, I'm not an expert on this, but you're looking at pollsters who are polling 500 to 700 people on the whole, in an election where there's about a dozen or more parties with realistic or semi-realistic prospects of getting elected, some of whom are hovering around a 3.25% national Knesset threshold. In other words, if you get 3.25% of the vote nationwide, you get your seats in the Knesset, and that means if you are any good at arithmetic, there's likely to be a minimum of 4 seats for a party that clears that threshold. And if they fall just one vote short of that threshold, all those votes go to waste. And you're doing polling on this, and you're polling, they say the polling error is, in the 3 and the 4% area. I can't reconcile those statistical assertions, because surely it takes only the very smallest, slightly unrepresentative group of answers to take parties above or below the threshold. And in these elections, as is almost always the case, a party getting 4 seats or disappearing can make all of the difference, including to your question. So in these elections, for example, on the right, Bezalel Smotrich's National Religious Zionism Party is apparently just above the threshold, but we'll know on the day. That's a party that will go with Netanyahu. At the other end of the spectrum, first of all, there's Ram, the party I mentioned, which we don't even know where to put it, and they're somewhere around the threshold. They were below it in a Channel 11 poll last night. They've been above it in plenty of others. Meretz, which is intermittently above and below on the Zionist left. Blue and White, Benny Gantz's party. What a fall from 33 seats. I think they won in the last election. First person charged by Rivlin last time, the president, to form a government. And now he's somewhere around that threshold. Some polls give him 5, some polls give him 4. I'm not convinced, but we can't know. And therefore, again, I'll come to your question, I promise, any second now. When we're thinking about what Bennett might do, your question is predicated on the assumption that the polls are something like accurate, which they may turn out to be, and they may turn out not to be. So then you have Bennett, who has said, Saar has said, I will not sit with Netanyahu. Should we believe him? I don't know. Benny Gantz said 3 elections in a row, the one thing that holds my party together is we will not sit with Netanyahu. And he sat with Netanyahu, the Labour Party, and it's even more astounding. Went into this bizarre situation where 2 of the 3 of its members who got elected last time joined the coalition. And to this day, I don't know what Merav Michaeli did, because her party was in the coalition. She certainly wasn't in the coalition insofar as she got to decide that. And now she's the leader of the Labour Party. The notion that Labour would join a Netanyahu coalition, we would have dismissed it before the last election. Bennett has said he will not sit under Lapid as prime minister. And he has certainly said, as you rightly say, he's not ruling out anybody, broadly speaking, although clearly he's also said, he said yesterday, he's going to be the responsible adult after the elections. He's going to ensure that a right-wing government is established. So that requires, presumably, Saar, and unless the polls are crazily way off, it requires Netanyahu and Likud. Well, can he do that? That depends on how many seats Yamina gets, how badly Netanyahu does. If Netanyahu is close to 60 without Bennett, then Bennett will be under immense pressure to join him and will have much less leverage. If Netanyahu is a long way short, who knows what bargains Bennett might try to drive? Are there some schemes cooked up that we don't know about? Lapid and Bennett used to be quite close, although you really get the very clear sense from both of them that they're certainly not close at all anymore. But, I think the questions like that, where we think we know the answers and where even the people themselves think that they've made their decisions, they'll still be affected by even relatively small shifts in voting that just change that political arithmetic when all the final votes are in.
Right, and I guess another thing to consider when we think about the possibility of a coalition that Netanyahu might seek to build is that whereas in the past when Netanyahu came back into politics for whatever it was 12 years ago, he always seemed to prefer a broad coalition with parties from the left and the center. And in recent years, he's sort of relied on this hardcore of right-wing religious parties, Haredi parties, of course, the two Haredi parties are his most loyal parties. And if it's true that he wants to, in this next coalition, pass legislation that's going to help him personally, which is certainly the accusation from the other side, then he's going to want to have that right-wing religious coalition, right? He's not going to want Labour in there or Benny Gantz in there ruining things for him, right?
So again, it would come down to Bennett, assuming the numbers are somewhere like what the polls are telling us. If he can put together a coalition, which is Likud, the two ultra-Orthodox parties, and Bezalel Smotrich's party, those parties and their members, you'd think, again, with all the caveat, we should assume that, we're speculating with informed knowledge, we hope, but nothing more than that. We would think that all of those four parties would give him support, and in some cases would even advance potentially legislations or quote unquote reforms that might enable Netanyahu to at least postpone his trial so long as he's prime minister. Right? That's what we think we know. And then if he did indeed try to put together a coalition with those parties and Bennett, the onus would be on Bennett, who is in favor of reforming some of the powers of the judiciary generally and the High Court, but who I'd be surprised personally, but I'm surprised personally all the time, I don't think would back retroactive legislation to stop Netanyahu in mid-trial. And then just the earlier part of your question, which relates to where Netanyahu has liked to position himself in his own coalitions over the years. Again, you're right. There have been times when he could have had a more uniform, more easily branded right-wing coalition than coalitions he chose to build. He has in years past, he's been in power for 12 years now, so it's been a long time, there've been a lot of governments, but there've certainly been times when he's clearly wanted to be somewhere in the center of his coalition ideologically, with people who were pressuring him from the left and people pressuring him from the right. Now, more recently, and certainly in this campaign, he started talking about a full right government. That might be a rhetorical phrase that he thinks is helpful to him, but we should remember that when push came to shove last summer, and he had a choice of policies that were, you define them as you wish, we'll specify. He had a choice of extending Israeli sovereignty into parts of the West Bank, with a Trump administration that was ambivalent, shall we say, about what it would have done, had green lighted it and then had orange lighted it. Not clear what the administration, it wasn't speaking with one voice. And Netanyahu was telling us all that provided the administration was on board, he was going to annex parts of the West Bank, extend sovereignty to parts of Judea and Samaria, depending on your terminology. And then he had the choice of that or a normalization process brokered by the Trump administration with the United Arab Emirates, in which a central, unavoidable element was the UAE's demand that he indefinitely postpone any unilateral annexation. Right? That was a condition. Now, I wasn't in the rooms, but I've spoken to people who were either in the room or very close to it. There's no question. I mean, the UAE in certain public forums makes very clear that no annexation was a key element of that process. I mean, there have been people from the Emirates who have asserted that it was the key element. I'm not sure that I buy that. I think this is a genuine process of normalization with Israel. I don't think it was a strategic heading off of Netanyahu. I don't think that at all. But it was certainly a core element. They wouldn't have gone on with this process. I don't think they would have gone on with this process if Netanyahu had moved ahead with annexation. So he had that choice and he didn't hesitate in terms of, I mean, maybe he thought about it long and hard, but in terms of, the news was breaking and he moved full speed ahead. He suspended annexation indefinitely. Off the record, I can give you guys the widely held belief is that he committed to at least 3 years, that there would be no unilateral annexation. So he made peace at the price of alienating and disappointing parts of the right that would have wanted him to make a different choice. So now he talks about a full right government, but people, I think will judge him for better and for worse, depending on what they make of that choice. But he made a choice, and it wasn't, if you like, a full right choice. It was a more centrist, a more mainstream. I don't even know how to define it, but there was something tangible there.
It's also proved very convenient for Gideon Saar because he's wanted to depict himself as make the claim that he's more right wing than Netanyahu, so Netanyahu can't use the leftist label. But he said, "I would love to annex, but I'm committed to the agreements that Netanyahu made."
Yes, I'll be brief on this. I'm not sure. We don't know what Saar would have done, but you're right. It's convenient. Bennett is quite interesting. It's worth, if you're interested, and if this is a vote deciding issue for you. Bennett was certainly not enthusiastic, no holds barred enthusiastic about normalization because annexation was being postponed. He was certainly not gushing. And, I'm sure some of you read, I did interviews recently with both Saar and Bennett. Bennett is very comfortably, avowedly hawkish, right wing, no ambivalence and no desire to portray himself as anything but. I'm not sure what Bennett would have decided in that situation.
Interesting. Okay, so that side of the map, or that side, that potential result of the election, at least has the advantage of, even though it's complicated, at least has the advantage of us knowing who would be the prime minister. If we look at the other side, then it gets much more complicated, because then we're looking at, Yesh Atid are polling, 18, 19, 20 seats. Saar is now down, I think, to 10. But even though that's the case, some would say that certainly Saar's people say, that he has a better chance of forming a government because, as you said, Bennett, for example, wouldn't sit under a Lapid prime ministership. Could we have a situation where Lapid agrees to someone other than him being prime minister, even if he has twice as many seats as the rival party in that anti-Netanyahu bloc?
Okay, so good. You ended up with a question I can answer. I don't know where you were going with that. And there's, there are lots of, we could, numbers are meant to be, unchanged, immutable, right?
Right.
And you look at, it's not, how can it be that complicated? There's 120 seats. Why is the arithmetic so difficult? And why does one little shift here and there? But it is, it's just, you can agonize, you can interpret, you can try to make sense endlessly of these potential partnerships, what a little shift in the numbers can do. And, after a while, your head starts to hurt. If yours doesn't, mine certainly does. But I can answer your last question, which is the answer is Lapid would, according to what he says, he would sit in a government, not as prime minister, under a leader who has many fewer seats in the Knesset than he does, because he thinks that the re-election of Netanyahu will be very dark for Israel, and this country will become, as he calls it, an illiberal democracy, somewhere in the area of Turkey and Hungary, which is what he said in the interview I did with him about 2-3 weeks ago. So he's been explicit about that. This is a guy who put aside his prime ministerial ambitions 3 elections in a row and put his established party and its election day organization, for example, at the disposal of Benny Gantz, who he's been quite polite about publicly, relatively speaking, given some of the language he might have used. But he's declaring a readiness to do that again, among other reasons, obviously, because he can see it's not going to work for him otherwise. It's very unlikely unless the numbers are way off. So yeah, there we have a definitive answer. Lapid has said he will sit and with people from, with whom he has big ideological differences, including Gideon Saar, for sure.
Okay, so one last question from me before I go to questions
I just want to add one more thing. What's striking about this, Paul, sorry, is that even in merits, I don't remember Nitzan Horovitz speaking about this, but the former deputy chief of staff, Yair Golan, who's high on the merits list, has said they'll sit with Sar as well, if that's the only way to oust Netanyahu. Again, it comes back to the first question we talked about at the beginning of this talk. The anti-Netanyahu camp is so adamant that the man is such a disaster that, never mind that ideological differences are not featuring in the campaign, ideological differences are being, brushed aside because of this shared assertion across parts of the spectrum that the prime minister has to go. It's staggering. And we didn't talk up enough the reasons why Netanyahu should not go. And it may be that people want to ask about that as well, but it is really quite staggering. The immensely improbable potential bedfellows, more so than blue and white, which was an unlikely mix of people. Now you've got, Gideon Sa'ar and Meretz are going to sit together. I don't think it's likely to happen, but they're potentially it could.
Okay, so that takes me to my last question, which is, in that kind of scenario, that would be, obviously we've had coalitions before with a mix of parties. That's the nature of Israeli politics. But as you say, this would really be, unprecedented, but very, very unusual to have, some of the most right-wing parties and the most left-wing Zionist party in the same coalition. In that scenario, if that were to take place, how could you see that working in practice? Could that be a government? Would that be a coalition which would sort of, say, okay, we've done our job, we've removed Netanyahu from politics, and now we're going to sort of collapse after 6 months and go to new elections? Or could it be a sort of, like the Labour Likud coalitions of the 1980s, which lasted for 4 years with rotation and had this sort of unhappy marriage between Shamir and Perez, but still managed to function?
So your guess is as good as mine.
Okay.
And, we can just continue to ask questions, right? So let's assume, which, I'm not sure this is going to happen at all, but let's say that an anti-Netanyahu coalition is assembled and sworn into office. Let me stop actually between those two. Let's assume that an anti-Netanyahu coalition is assembled. So a first question one might ask before it gets sworn into office is, what would happen in Likud, right? Would this party stick together when they can see they're heading into opposition? Or would, Netanyahu said today he's identified potential defectors in some of the parties that are opposing him. Would people in Likud, Gideon Sa'ar's counter to Netanyahu's assertion today was, that there are people in Likud who say much nastier things about you than I ever have done, right? In other words, there are plenty of people just waiting for the opportunity to be rid of Netanyahu from within Likud, so says Sa'ar. So if there is a majority for an anti-Netanyahu coalition, would it even get sworn in that constellation, or would strange things start to happen in, by the way, just the same way they happened last year, with parties splitting apart and people defecting, which I think is, a really relevant question because it's not improbable. And then, as you rightly speculate, I think, if such a coalition was assembled where they have no common goal except ousting Netanyahu, why would there be an ongoing common goal in holding it together? Maybe they'd all agree that they want elections, or maybe when they did their polling, enough of them decide that, we better stick together for a while because, things are going to get worse for enough of our parties. Would it be a glorious opportunity, Paul, for electoral reform? Because you'd have a Knesset that, that has been completely remade along very bizarre lines, and responsible people come to the conclusion that we need to do something quite dramatic to prevent, endless indecisive elections. It's just, radically unfathomable. You didn't even get me to the who do I think is going to win these elections.
I didn't want to go there. I didn't see the point.
Of course I don't know, but I do think we're voting in a pandemic. I do think that our death toll leaves room for criticism, but our vaccination drive is rightly being applauded around the world. I think the mood of the country changed a little bit in the last few days since the country opened up last Sunday. You're still seeing majorities in polls saying they don't think COVID is behind us. You're still seeing majorities in polls saying they don't want Netanyahu to carry on as prime minister. But I think if you took a step back and you compared the situation now with 2-3 weeks ago, and you asked, with whom is the momentum? I think the momentum points against the kind of coalition that we were just idly speculating about.
Okay, so thank you very much. I'm going to go to some questions. We've had a number of questions from the audience. Actually, we've had a number of questions about the topic which you just mentioned briefly, which is electoral reform. So I'll just sort of try and summarize 3 or 4 questions that we've had about it. So, you know, the electoral system that we have has failed to produce a government 3 elections in a row. It seems to be dysfunctional. It's also the case that MKs are not directly responsible to their voters because of the system that we have, but to their parties or to their own careers. Therefore, there's obviously a call for the system to be changed in that direction, more representative direction. Do you see? How do you see that moving forward? Is there a possibility? In the past, we haven't been able to do anything other than, you know, raise the threshold and then the short-lived, ill-fated direct elections for the prime minister. What do you see happening in the future?
Yeah, so, you know, again, I don't know, but to change the system, the people in it would need to be voting to change it, and so long as they would feel that it would disadvantage them, they're probably quite unlikely to do it. We did try about 25 years ago. There were a sequence of 2 to 3 elections, depending on how you count it, where we had a vote for prime minister, as well as the party votes. And the idea of that reform was the thinking was, if you've chosen your prime minister, you'll want that prime minister to have a strong party behind him or her, and therefore you're likely to vote for the major parties. In fact, contrary folk that we are, Israelis did the opposite, right? We chose a prime minister and then we voted for, you know, the taxi drivers party because we'd already done sort of the big issues, and it actually weakened the major parties. So we abandoned that. You know, very smart people with much more experience and wisdom than I have come up with all kinds of things. They talked about a 50-50 or actually a 60-60, just to confuse you already, but, you know, half of the Knesset elected on a constituency basis and half on proportional representation nationwide. I don't know, and people who are on this call may have really good ideas. I cannot imagine the committee, how are they even going to set up the committee and who's going to be on it when they decide how to divide Israel into constituencies. I mean, you could engineer totally different election results before anyone went to the polls simply by dividing Israel one way or another, okay? Geographically, population density wise. I mean, just, you know, you can speculate idly among yourselves. So who's going to agree to the terms by which you set up a constituency basis? So I don't know how we get to this. I think the system's poor. I'm not as insistent as I would have been a few years ago that it just has to be reformed. I'm not sure. I think lots of countries have lots of problems with lots of their systems with the best of intentions. You have American elections where the president does not win the popular vote. You have American elections where almost everybody's vote is largely irrelevant because so many states are just, you know, slam dunk states one way or another. So in a way, only a small minority of Americans really feel that they're part of the essence of the democracy in those votes. You know, in Britain, I don't know how troubled people are on this call, but both of the people speaking in the main here are ex-Brits. We apologize for that. I am married to an American, if it's any comfort, and I have Israeli children, so I've got all the bases covered. But in Britain, you can come second in 600 plus constituencies, and you'll not get a single seat in Parliament. Well, that can't be right either. And therefore, you know, our system is incredibly pure democratically. Every vote counts unless it falls below the threshold, but, you know, it counted then too. You just used it on a party that didn't make it. It's a very, very pure democratic system. And therefore, when you're talking about reforming it, it needs to be pretty smart reform. And when you're talking about the practicalities of achieving that reform, I just can't see it. I can't see it in the foreseeable future. Even 4 elections have not, I mean, think about it. We're in the 4th election. There's been no significant movement for electoral reform. We're in a ridiculous cycle of elections, but there is no real meat behind any movement for reform. Okay.
Thank you very much. There's a couple of questions here about Netanyahu, which I think, which I'm going to ask you to answer together. One of them says what you think are the reasons in favor of Netanyahu staying on, and beyond the vaccines, or maybe that's the main point. And the other question, which is related, is how do you explain the paradox between Bibi's accomplishments, which even many of his opponents acknowledge, and the extremely low esteem in which he is held by so many people?
Okay, I mean, those are, they're great questions, and everyone, I think probably lots of people would answer them with very different nuances. But broadly speaking, in favor of Netanyahu, the Middle East is a toxic and unpredictable neighborhood, and we're a very small country. We're 9 miles wide at our narrowest point. It's a lousy neighborhood. You don't need to go very far in any direction to either be in the sea or in potentially extremely hostile areas. And further to the east, you have Iran with a regime that is avowedly seeking Israel's elimination, and that I think many of us in Israel believe needs to be taken very seriously in terms of its threats, and mistrust quite profoundly, and see encouraging terrorist organizations on potentially all of our borders, and very, very emphatically on the northern border and the southern border. And as far as I'm more than willing to believe, improving its capacity to move towards a bomb, should it deem the moment appropriate, right? So this is a bad neighborhood. And you come to Israel, if you're not Israelis, and if you're not Israelis, please God, you'll be able to come to Israel again soon, because it will be safe to do so. You land here and you live here most of the time, and you think you're somewhere in the relatively trouble-free West, right? There's nowhere where life does not have the sort of threat of nefarious forces. But you would not think that you're in the Middle East. I mean, Syria, Damascus is an hour away from the northern Israeli border. Millions of people displaced, hundreds of thousands of people killed. And life goes on here as though sometimes we were, something like Scandinavia. And it's not even as ridiculously exaggerated a point to make. And you've had a prime minister who for 12 years has steered Israel through this toxic and unpredictable region, in a country, moreover, where we have mandatory conscription, not for everybody. And that, of course, brings us to negatives, because of his readiness to heed ultra-Orthodox concerns, for which he is often criticized by people who do not share that attitude. It's not full national service. I'm digressing a little, but why don't we have national service for everybody? I can understand the army doesn't need everyone doing military service, but to me, there's no reason why everybody should not have rights and responsibilities in this country as well as benefits. But leaving that aside, this is a country with widespread national service, shall we say, where in many elections, we used to vote about who's going to keep our kids safe. Well, Netanyahu is not a military adventurer. There can be criticisms. We failed to win decisively over Hamas, during the years that he's been in power, for example. But relatively speaking, the toll of our dead in military conflict is low. Don't underestimate how central that is in terms of why Netanyahu is held in high regard, including by people like myself, for example, who are very critical of him for assaulting law enforcement over his trial, for being divisive in Israel internally. There's a lot to be said in his favor. In terms of asserting the concern about Iran, he's articulate on the world stage. He's not more articulate and more effective than his Israeli rivals. He's better than just about anybody in the world in terms of global public diplomacy. You may agree with him, you may disagree with him, but he is erudite and he is composed, and he doesn't do it instinctively. It's not like he goes out and says whatever comes into his head. He takes it incredibly seriously. He's a very, very effective advocate for Israel, and of course, especially the Israel that he sees in terms of policies. But there, there's an awful lot to be said. And then so then why the low esteem? Because in there as well is recognition of Netanyahu, the politician. Netanyahu, who did say in 2015 that the Arabs are streaming to the ballot boxes, and telling us a few months ago that he didn't mean to disenfranchise or imply discrimination against the Arab electorate. He was only saying they're going to vote for the joint list. Well, that's not what he said on election day in 2015. Who brands all of his enemies, political enemies, as the left. Avigdor Lieberman is now the left. And I suppose Gideon Sa'ar and potentially Naftali Bennett are the left as well, who is a very divisive politician within Israel. And like I say, you're asking me to be on this call. So, I do feel if you have a prime minister who alleges that the state prosecution and the police have joined forces with the media and the left to stage an attempted political coup, you're not going to be reinforcing your public's necessary trust in the hierarchies and pillars of your democracy. It's not a healthy thing to do. To say that you're innocent, to say that you will fight your legal battle to your last sinew, to prove your innocence, and you're confident that you'll do so, to say that you deny the charges, to say that you think the charges are unfounded. These are all entirely legitimate things. To claim that the state prosecution and the police, by the way, led by people who you yourself appointed, have somehow, for some reason, decided that there's nothing more important than inventing alleged crimes against you. I think that's one of the reasons. And we're in a situation now where at the same time as so much can and should be said to Netanyahu's credit, we've reached a situation where he's on television every few days. He's asked the same questions and he gives the same answer on the point that you made about legislation to thwart his trial, and nobody believes him anymore. Are you going to advance legislation? I don't deal with that. Would you support? I'm not. It doesn't matter what he says. Nobody really believes him anymore. That's a very unfortunate situation. By the way, it may be part of the wider malaise of politics generally. But there, like I said, and like your two questions really, they frame the discussion. There is so much to be said to Netanyahu's credit, and so much that so many people find disturbing about him. And maybe just one last thing, just to put it all together a bit, and I've written this before, so I apologize if people have read it. He's been prime minister for 12 years consecutively, and 3 years before that. My kids are in their mid and late 20s, like many of your kids and grandchildren, maybe some of you yourselves. People have grown up with Prime Minister and Benjamin Netanyahu being, it's the same thing, right? That they've only ever known one prime minister. I think that's a huge advantage for him. I think there's a worry at the back of even Netanyahu critics' minds that maybe none of these other people are going to be able to do as effective a job. And that's one of the big challenges that all these people against him are facing now. And their challenge, I'll just say this, I think it got harder because of what happened with Gantz. Okay, we had 3 elections where a party of security chiefs battered away at Netanyahu's great credential, Mr. Security credential, and they almost won power. And then they kind of, collapsed. And Gantz was revealed to have been very, very trusting in terms of his politics. I'm putting it in the least pejorative way that I can. I think that other people who want to challenge Netanyahu are going to have a higher hurdle now, because the last people who really came very close to ousting him kind of tore themselves apart in an orgy of disunity.
Okay, thank you very much. That was a admirable, superb exposition on Netanyahu in a very short space of time, on one leg, so to speak.
Well, we've dealt with him for a long time. Yeah,
right. You've had time to think about it. So let's go from Netanyahu to Gideon Sa'ar. There are a couple of questions here. One asking how you think Sa'ar, if he were prime minister, would deal with the Biden administration differently to Netanyahu. And somewhat related to that, there was a question about whether Sa'ar has said anything at all that you know of about Iran. Because the questioner says they were at a rally with Sa'ar, I think yesterday or earlier this week, and he didn't mention Iran at all.
So I did interview Sa'ar about 3 weeks ago, and I certainly asked him about Iran, and his answer, as I recall it, go look it up by all means, because I don't remember it. directly everything that he said about it, but he said it relates to Biden and Iran. He said, we've got this incredible asset of this partnership with the United States. We have to work, respectfully with the United States. We have to ensure that that we've enabled a dialogue where we can keep bringing our knowledge and experience and information about Iran, because he was basically saying, we've got really hard evidence of how dangerous these people are. And rather than be sort of in a confrontational mode with the Americans, we need to persuade them of the rightness of our concerns, which should be their exact concerns. So that was the kind of line that he was following. Netanyahu was openly confrontational with Obama. He went to Congress and he essentially lobbied against the deal. I'm not sure. I think Netanyahu would say, look, I had to do what I did. Critics would say, well, you risked alienating parts of the American political spectrum. Defenders would say there was nothing that could be done with the Obama administration. Critics would say, yeah, but you're risking doing it again now with Biden. And the argument's going to go back and forth. But Saar, insofar as he commented in our interview, it was like, we've got really good. One of the most amazing things, I want to digress a little just because it's nice to do so. That Mossad operation that we've acknowledged, unlike many things that we don't acknowledge. Israel sent, I think it's acknowledged, dozens of Mossad agents to Tehran and busted open safes in a warehouse and by the way, sifted through the material and then brought 5 truckloads, lorry loads of documentation overland out of Iran to show the world that Iran was lying about its nuclear program. It's a staggering thing. One of the most extraordinary operations that you can conceive of, and we shouldn't take it for granted. It's not central to this political conversation, but it's part of the answer. We've got all this information. Netanyahu gives speeches and says, by the way, they're doing A, B, and C. And a year or two later, the IAEA says, yeah, actually, we found soil samples at site A that suggest the storage of nuclear-related materials. And then, the Times of Israel and others point out, well, actually, that's the site that Netanyahu specified in his speech to the UN General Assembly in 2000, whatever it was, right? So we have this extraordinary amount of information. And Saar's approach, I think, would be to try to be persuasive and make sure America and Israel are very close on this. I think Netanyahu would say that that's exactly his goal too. He's just quite strident about warning about, getting it wrong.
Right. And I think one of the things that, I think I'm right in saying that one of the things that both Saar, or certainly Saar's party and people within Saar's party and Lapid have both done is to say they agree with the sort of Netanyahu's hawkishness on Iran and the deal, but they're critical of him for affecting the bipartisan consensus in Washington.
Yeah,
right. I think Danny Dayan said that.
Yeah,
from Saar's party.
That's for sure. By the way, you should know, there are people in the Israeli security establishment who do not agree, who think that the deal was good, that it was the best deal that could be gotten, and that Trump's unilateral withdrawal has been counterproductive, etc. There, it's not. There's certainly mainstream. The mainstream from and pretty wide mainstream, including political leaders and Israelis. Is believed that there was a better deal to be done, and is pretty aggrieved that Obama said, you don't know what's in the deal when it was being negotiated, and no deal would have satisfied you once it was done. I don't think Israelis feel that that's true. We thought that they were in the process of negotiating a deal that could have been better, and of course there was a deal that would have satisfied us, a deal that reliably dismantled and inspected to ensure that Iran couldn't move ahead, and this deal plainly hasn't achieved that.
Okay. Changing tack a little, there were a couple of questions asking whether you think there's the possibility of a sort of surprise by Netanyahu in the next few days, which one of the questions pointed out the abortive trip to the UAE was supposed to be that, but something to sort of to boost his numbers in the last few days.
Okay, you realize the logical flaw in the question, right? Because if it was a surprise,
then you wouldn't know.
As long as you know. But I'm sure Netanyahu would, the UAE trip was something he wanted to do. It was rumored that it would not just have been the UAE, that there would have been a meeting with maybe the Saudi Crown Prince or leaders of Sudan. There are things that I know, and there are things that I know as much about as you do. It's not clear to me. It's reported that the Emiratis were a little wary about it last week, and were really, really not going there this week. I don't know if this is true. Netanyahu is a very, very effective politician, and anything that will help boost his support, he will anything within reason, he will try to achieve. Eli Cohen's remains. There's no American administration, as there was for some time, that before elections did things like recognizing Israeli sovereignty on the Golan and legislation or policies and positions regarding settlements and settlement produce and so on. So he's not going to get that boost from the United States. It is rumored that the Americans actually kind of were telling the UAE not to host him. I don't know that for a fact. I know that as a report. They should all be trying it, but it's easier when you're the prime minister. The biggest, it's not a surprise, but as I said before, the biggest, boost for him, you just compare the mood of the country today as opposed to 3-4 weeks ago. And the mood of the country is not some kind of abstract, bizarre thing. We're looking at a falling number of people, of serious COVID patients. We're looking at almost every day now, a lower rate of contagion. We're not out of the woods. We're at the levels, I think, of like last July, but we're every day now we're seeing things that are better than they were since December, for example. And this is with the economy open again. So, I'm sure he'd like some very positive surprises, but in terms of his good fortune or his excellent vaccination procurement, there are a lot of factors working in his favor, I would say, at the moment.
Okay. There's a question here. Interesting point. I'm just going to read it as it's written. That you spoke about these parties coming together to oust Bibi, but just saying no Bibi without giving an ideology or a program about what they want to do isn't going to help you vote for them. Is that a problem that you think they have? Basically, the anti-Bibi parties. Is it true? Is it even true as an allegation?
I think there's two things. There's the fact that there are several ideologically different parties who are united today around only that goal of ousting Netanyahu. And that constellation is more bizarre and extends further across the spectrum than before, right? I mean, blue and white was a strange mix of, Moshe Ya'alon is more hawkish than Netanyahu. Certainly wasn't always, but Moshe Ya'alon, the politician, is to Netanyahu's right. And there he was in a party with Benny Gantz somewhere in the indefinable center somewhere, and Yair Lapid also, he would say, in the center, but certainly not anathema to the left, for example. That was already an unlikely alliance. And now you have Gideon Sa'ar, Naftali Bennett, and Yair Golan and Nitzan Horovitz in Meretz all saying, we have to get rid of Netanyahu. So the alliance is only on that one issue. The individual parties would respond to that question by saying, we are overflowing with ideology, and our ideology is clear. Yesh Atid has a very serious political program. Naftali Bennett will talk to you for as long as you want to listen about his economic strategy, for example. They do have ideological positions, more credible, more well thought out, and less so. But if you're thinking, what they're... In a way, it's a kind of a two-stage thought process for a voter, I suppose, right? Do you want Netanyahu as your prime minister? Is stage one. If you do, here's the menu of parties who will achieve that for you. If you don't, here's the group that will achieve that wants to get rid of him. Once you've chosen which of those, then you go for the one whose ideology is most to your taste. Likud, we are told now, Netanyahu, I think even himself has said, I have no problem with you voting for the Religious Zionism Party, because his electoral calculation is that otherwise they might slip below the threshold. So he's even saying, you don't have to vote for me, just vote for one of those other pro-Netanyahu parties. So like I say, a two-stage thing. There's no question that the defining choice, the first choice, do you or do you not want Netanyahu? But once you've made that choice, these parties all want to woo you with something more than we just don't want Netanyahu, or we just do want Netanyahu as prime minister.
Right. Okay, I'm going to see if we have more questions. So I'm going to just, I think, finish with this question, which is, Netanyahu has been prime minister for such a long time now, and he's, as you say, he's been the dominant figure in Israeli politics for not just this 12 years, but even beyond that, going back to his first spell as prime minister in the 90s. He's Israel's longest serving prime minister. When we do eventually reach a post-Netanyahu Israel, whether it's this election or not, some years down the line, who knows? Do you foresee? I mean, are there people within? Gideon Sa'ar's now left the Likud, formed his own party. Are there people within the Likud that could take the reins and ensure that the Likud retains its position as the preeminent party in Israeli politics, which it has been for such a long time?
Okay, so it's a good question, and I would extend it even further. It goes to that same point about it being, I think unthinkable is too strong, but it requires a sort of effort of will, and there's certainly a psychological hurdle to imagine Israel without Netanyahu. He's synonymous with the prime ministership at this stage, and it's Bennett and Lapid, certainly Bennett, because I asked him about it a lot. I think I asked the other two as well. I asked them all about it, and they all, they recognize that there's a psychological hurdle, and they, Bennett took, but believe me, Israel's going to be just fine in the post-Netanyahu era. There's a lot of that being said, and there's a recognition that people need to be persuaded. I think even, this is a really quite radical thing to say, but I think even some of Netanyahu's most bitter critics, some of them, somewhere in the back of their mind, not necessarily very largely, ask themselves, yeah, but what's it going to be like without Netanyahu? I think he's been there for so long, and I argue in terms of regional capability. There is much to be said, and therefore, life without Netanyahu, I guess there's the downside of people going on and on. America, there I like your system. Okay, 2 terms for the president. I think there's a lot to be said for something like that. Britain, where people think I'm still very British, but I'm not even sure I ever voted in Britain because I moved here a long time ago. But Thatcher wanted to go on, and Tony Blair, they both served for about a decade. It's not healthy. It's not healthy. I don't know. I'm going to really digress a little bit now because you said it was the last question.
Go for it.
I've been doing my job for 9-10 years, and I hope I'm fresh, and I hope I've not fallen into bad habits. But and heaven forbid, I'm not making any comparison between running a website and holding the destiny of a nation in my hands. Really, 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 I'm well aware. I'm just a journalist. I just write about stuff. But when you're at the head of a hierarchy, and especially so sensitive a position as a prime minister or a president, there's something problematic about being there for too long. You make friends, by the way, by definition, and then you look kindly upon your friends, and without being remotely nefarious or anything other than clean, that can lead you into difficult paths. Anyway, all of this, and countries with leaders in power for too long, bad things can happen. And then the specific of your question, which is a hard question because of that. Who in Likud? So you on the call, many of you know as well as I do, who are the people in Likud? Can we imagine, Gilad Erdan or Israel Katz or Nir Barkat? And probably I've left out many people who would be very offended if they knew that David Horovitz wasn't citing them as a potential Likud leader after Netanyahu. They all seem quite small by comparison to Netanyahu. Part of that is if Netanyahu, heaven forbid, fell ill this evening, I don't know. I guess it would be Gantz, who's still the alternate prime minister. But in the pre-Gantz era, when Netanyahu would go abroad, he'd name a different acting prime minister each time. There is no designated successor within Likud, and that's a strategic decision. When Sa'ar challenged him within Likud, he was accused of something akin to treachery by some of Netanyahu's supporters. He mounted a democratic challenge in a leadership election and accepted the result. So, there's that climate there in which potential rivals to Netanyahu within Likud have been diminished. It's almost unthinkable that someone in Likud would poke their head above the parapet and say, I'd like to challenge the prime minister. We saw what happened there with Saar. But the fact is, of course, that what's that cliche? The graveyards are full of people who thought they were indispensable, right? Believe me, the Times of Israel will trundle along nicely without David Horovitz. It's very different for Israel. It's probably, I can't imagine there's a harder job in the world than being the prime minister of Israel. That weight of responsibility. But this country, had prime ministers before Netanyahu, and it will have prime ministers after Netanyahu. And all of us who care about it need to be sure that whoever the prime minister is, we thrive under his or her leadership. Okay,
with that positive note, right. I want to thank David Horovitz very much for a really extraordinary exposition of Israeli politics and answering your questions and analysis, and not giving some predictions, but without really giving predictions, because, as you said, it's impossible. And I think everyone should read the Times of Israel, read David's writings and those of other journalists on the website. It's really, I think, one of the very best places to go to follow what's happening in Israel in English. And for those of you in Israel, have a good election day next week. I'm not going to say good luck to everyone, because that means that's impossible, because we're all going to have different expectations and wishes. But let's all hope that whatever the result, as David said, Israel continues to thrive as a Jewish and democratic state. Thank you all very much, and I'll be back next week. Bye.
Thank you so much, Paul. Thank you, everybody. Be well.